English translation. 915th contact. Thursday, 7th August, 2025. 8:42 hours.
Here you are, my friend. Greetings, Edward.
Yes, I had to hurry a bit. But hello also, my friend.
I'm pressed about your poem, which you didn't want to mention openly when I tried to dictate it to you last time. I would like to say that you should at least mention some of what I would dictate to you.
That could be done if that's what you mean, but I don't think it would do any good, because the Earthlings don't listen to what is said and warned anyway. It is always only a vanishingly small minority that thinks about what is said and warned about something, and an even smaller minority of said minority then also effectively implements everything and does what has been said and declared to be the correct thing to do. But this, as I said, is a minority of human beings whose correct action and work is like a drop of water on a hot stone. Besides, the large part of the poem is, in my opinion, too incriminating for many human beings with regard to the predictions, consequently these.
You may be right about that, so it is probably better if...
Correct. And there are also the forces of the authorities and governments working against the fact that the right and really necessary things can be done. This especially what is to be done regarding nature, which after all is all regulated from the authorities and the government by experts according to laws and regulations, so that nature and its fauna and flora can thrive. These experts, as I have realized many times, only have a big mouth, but they don't really understand anything about nature and its flora and fauna, nor about its diversity and biodiversity, just as little as those experts who idiotically pass laws and regulations to protect everything. But talking and explaining is useless, because these know-it-alls are incapable of thinking and seeing and understanding everything as it really is. This is evident here with regard to the center, which was in a miserable state, because there was only clear cutting all around, and the forest was cut down, while the rest that still existed was in an unkempt, dilapidated state. The meadowland was also poorly cultivated and full of cattle tracks all around, where not even grass could grow. 2 apple trees and 4 pear trees were more dead than alive, and in such a dilapidated state that they had to be cut down. The main house and its annexes on the north side of the house were in such a desolate state, and partly only boarded up with metal sheets that they had to be demolished and rebuilt, as did the 2 toilets, which were only temporary sheds and whose drainage ditch was simply diverted into the public waterway. The cellar was 1.20 meters underwater for 16 years, according to Mr. Furrer, who was no longer able to read the water meter during this time. There was also the kitchen, whose windows, floor, and walls were so demolished that everything had to be redone. The shed was also in a very desolate state and close to collapsing, as was the garage and its wooden alterations, so everything had to be rebuilt. The bee house, which stood next to the garage, was already half collapsed, as was also what was called the chicken house and another small building next to the garage. In the main house, many of the rooms, etc., were so broken that they first had to be rebuilt and made habitable, while a large cesspit and then a septic tank had to be built. It was impossible to get around the main house without getting stuck in the dirt, even in front of the house on the local road. On 2 occasions, Jacobus and Rolf Wechter even fell down the slope while trying to drive the tractor around the house, and were more than lucky not to be buried under the tractor. So the slope had to be concreted up, just as everything around the house also had to be concreted. What I have just said is effectively only the main part of what the center really was. But the Turbenthal municipal authorities and the cantonal administration in Zurich didn't seem to care at all, because nothing was done about it in any wise. On the contrary, when I intervened with the municipal administration, they stubbornly refused to grant me any building permit or permission to work in the forest or on the land. The consequence of this was that someone from the local authority team came to their senses and told me that I should do and produce everything that was urgently required and necessary against the local authority itself, because it had been decided that we would never receive a license for anything from the local authority. Because I was involved with UFOs, was against all religion and all beliefs, and we were therefore unwelcome here in Hinterschmidruti, and everything would be done to make us disappear again. And today it actually seems to be the case that all the old ways of doing things are continuing, because now the old theater is started all over again. Now, I have actually deviated from what I wanted to say, namely that the idiotic laws and regulations etc. prohibit the citizenry from doing the right thing, which would be interested in ensuring that everything necessary is done with regard to nature and its fauna and flora in order to keep them thriving and active and, correctly, alive. In contrast, elsewhere the authorities and the whole of the authorities appoint and employ nature officers as experts, such as foresters, landscape designers, conservationists, etc., who, however, really have no real knowledge, but only show knowledge learnt by rote and are really nothing more than non-experts in their field, and are placed by the authorities or the state in front of the citizens, and above all, in front of those who effectively know the subject matter. What's more, the official and authoritative experts, who are really only experts in name only, are placed in front of the citizenry in order to take action against them with threats, decrees, and fines. Because of this kind of morbidly lowly intelligent and simple-minded people from the authorities and the authorities as a whole, from whom the righteous are of course always excluded, it is effectively the case that slowly but surely the whole of vital nature and biodiversity is simply dying. To use Zurich German. This, just as more and more flora and fauna are also being wiped out because we have idiots in government who are completely irresponsible and obviously don't understand anything about nature or life. However, they are also incapable of grasping what their illusory thinking and actions mean for the future. For example, because they consistently destroy the diversity of fauna and flora, namely because they idiotically prefer to have motorways, roads, and all sorts of other things built in order to further destroy all natural life and promote 19 overpopulation even more. And also to expose nature and its fauna and flora to further pernicious and destructive machinations, and to drive destruction further and ever higher. It has now come to the point where there is talk, for example, of what Svath and I warned of back in 1947, that all life will be poisoned, namely that artificial materials will cause very nasty mischief. Now it has been reported on the TV news that the artificial materials predicted back in the 1940s, which are now called plastics, will poison marine and terrestrial life and cause it to die miserably. Infosperber has published an article on this subject by Urs P. Gash.
We breathe in the most microplastics in our cars and at home, worrying for researchers. Invisible microfibers from plastics enter the lungs with added chemicals. Urs P. Gash.
Children and adults inhale many invisible plastic particles, especially inside cars. Monkey business/deposit photos.
The actual exposure to inhaled microplastics has so far been massively underestimated. According to the study by the University of Toulouse's Institute of Environmental Geosciences, which was published in the journal PLOS One on 30 July 2025. Health consequences can become noticeable years later. The researchers cite inflammation, cell damage, or other health problems. Plastics consist of polymers that are made from fossil raw materials. In most cases, additives are added to them. Problematic combination with chemicals. The smallest invisible microplastic particles with a length of 1 to 10 micrometers are respirable. This corresponds to dust particles. Most microplastics contain heavy metals or persistent organic pollutants that have been added to the plastics as additives. The study states, these chemicals can be released in the body and potentially disrupt endocrine functions, editor's note, hormone balance, impair cell processes, or increase the risk of cancer. The researchers conclude, the combination of physical and chemical stress factors makes the inhalation of microplastics particularly worrying from a public health perspective. Children inhale around 47,000 fibers per day. The researchers have extrapolated the amount of fibers inhaled. Children inhale around 47,000 respirable plastic particles indoors every day, adults 68,000. The authors of the study comment, inhaled microplastics with a length of 1 to 10 micrometers can overcome cell barriers, enter the bloodstream and potentially have systemic effects, including stress, immune reactions, and even damage to vital organs over time. Concentration particularly high in cars. The researchers measured a 4 times higher concentration of microfibers in the interior air of cars than in the air of homes. One reason for this could be the active ventilation in cars. The concentration was also many times higher indoors when 2 persons were very active in the home. However, most human beings spend more time in flats than in cars. The researchers did not measure indoor air pollution in offices. According to the study, 3/4 of the microplastics floating in the air in homes are polyethylene PE. This is mainly used for packaging household goods and toys. In contrast, PE only accounts for 19% of the air inside cars. At 25%, the robust, resistant and grease-repellent polyamide PA was the most common material, followed by the rigid, hard and scratch-resistant styrene ABS at 19% and the mechanically resilient and dimensionally stable PET at a further 14%. The study states, PA and PE are common textiles for car upholstery, while ABS and PET are often used for dashboards and interior paneling. Source: MDPI. The risk to human beings depends more on the size and shape of the microplastic than on the type of plastic. International Plastics Conference from 5th to 14th August. Representatives from over 100 countries will gather in Geneva for the final United Nations Conference to discuss measures against global plastic pollution. Larger particles end up in the digestive tract. Slightly larger microplastic particles, 10 to 300 micrometers, hardly make it into the lungs, but they do reach the throat via the mucous membranes. From there, microplastics can reach the gastrointestinal tract by swallowing. The researchers assume that even more microplastics reach the gastrointestinal tract in this way than through food and drink. Most of the microparticles are excreted in the feces, but not all of them. Some particles pass from the intestine into the blood, and from there into the liver and other organs, even the brain.
It is now said that plastic particles are even being absorbed through the food, drink, and breathing of human beings, making them ill. This is what humanity has already come to through its sheer massive overpopulation, as a result of all kinds of crazy machinations, which also include the production of plastic, which is irresponsibly produced mainly by the USA and China, and in Europe by Germany. But Germany's government is also behaving irresponsibly in that the most influential top elements of the government, which is in itself unfit for office, are now also supporting the Israeli mass murderer Netanyahu and his army of murderers with regard to genocide. Nobody has yet realized that this Hitler-like man, this mass murderer with his army of murderers, doesn't give a damn about the hostages because he is only indulging in his hatred of the Arabs and his genocidal behavior. He doesn't give a damn about the lives of the hostages, because all that matters to him is that he can carry out his delusions of genocide with his army of murderers. And so that he can carry out his Hitler mentality and Hitler actions against the Palestinians, also against the Arabs in Syria, he can afford to do this unscathed by revealing big lies and thus beguiling the Israeli people and discrediting them again, as the Nazis and Hitler have already done and murdered over 60 million human beings. And that he not only wants to bring Lebanon under his mendacious and murderous thumb, but also Jordan little by little, as you have fathomed his mindset, as you told me. Of course he won't say anything about it publicly. And the fact that he is supported in his murderous activities by the American dictator Trump helps him all the more to realize his mean and dirty plans. But as the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together, and that's exactly what they are, birds of a feather. The mass murderer and genocidist Netanyahu and the American dictator Trump, who is terrorizing the whole world, can do whatever they want without the Earth's leaders deposing them. The dictator of America is such a hegemonic and also otherwise delusional and irresponsible maniac that his absolute falsity and inability to think clearly and rationally is glaringly obvious. However, as a result of his low intelligence, this is obviously not recognizable to the majority of the American population, nor to the world's leaders, who also cowardly kowtow to this American zero, this dictator, instead of doing the right thing and confronting this good-for-nothing in the correct manner. If that were done, which would be really easy to arrange, then the guy would be sawed off and spent all his days in security custody without further ado, which would also be necessary for various leaders of other countries. By the way, because they are only leaders in name only. However, to say what the arrangement against the dictator Trump should be, which, however, would not apply to other no-good leaders of other countries, is not for me to explain, but for the cowardly elements who lick dictator Trumps. That, unfortunately, is the truth, and cannot, with all decency and other words, be said otherwise. And anyone who takes offense at this must probably go over their own books and think carefully and not in disbelief about why only the open truth can really clarify and put things right. If in America the cowardly majority of the American people simply let dictator Trump have his way and even support him, just as practically all states on Earth, also Switzerland, are just as cowardly in front of this slimy, creeping tail, as they say, and simply let this hegemonist do his thing, then nothing can be done. But what can an individual citizen do, apart from denouncing everything that is not correct and running the risk of being prosecuted for it? Especially in Switzerland, because there are elements in the government that have criminally betrayed the country's neutrality and made a pig of it by adopting sanctions from the EU dictatorship and applying them against Russia, thereby destroying the friendship with this country, of all countries to which Switzerland should be very grateful, which is also noticed abroad. This is effectively the case, along with other incidents that violate Switzerland's constitution, such as the Federal Council taking action without the consent of the people by conducting negotiations with the EU dictatorship. The following newspaper article, which was sent to me yesterday from Germany, is sufficient proof that other countries are also realizing this.
Wake-up call for Switzerland incompetent leadership, ingratiation with countries that behave disloyally towards Switzerland. A country that sets standards is sinking into the Stockholm Syndrome and losing its footing. Solution: back to the old values. Peter Henseler, Tuesday, 5th of August, 2025.
Introduction. Switzerland was hit with a tariff hammer of 39% by the USA. Before Trump, by the way, it was 0%. Switzerland has one of the most expensive infrastructures in the world. Everything has to be top class. However, this also requires the country's and the government's performance in terms of education, labor, and political assertiveness to be top. If Switzerland can muster the energy and courage to move away from its comfort zone again, and the population is on board, the problem is solvable. Otherwise not. From proud David to random follower. Small and poor Switzerland has always been small and poor for a long time, so poor that many emigrated or had to offer their services as mercenaries in order to survive. I come from such a family of farmers and mercenaries, 12 children, 5 pairs of shoes. That's how my grandfather described his childhood. Luck is also part of it. Neutrality. But we were also lucky. For example, When we were granted the privilege of neutrality at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, incidentally on the initiative of Tsar Alexander I, whose former Swiss tutor, Frederick César de la Harpe, successfully motivated the young Tsar to do so. Yes, Switzerland owes its neutrality to Russia, and thanks Russia by trampling on it and neutrality. I have already dealt in detail with the wrong path Switzerland is taking in 2023. In Switzerland is in danger. Respect hard-earned. The Swiss not only accepted the gift of neutrality, but also created a jewel out of the poor Alpine Republic, through hard work, skill, tenacity, and modest but consistent diplomacy that spared the country from both world wars. All this was recognized and respected internationally, so that Switzerland's good offices were gladly accepted by many countries and world powers. The Red Cross, founded by the Swiss Henri Dunant, the League of Nations, the Olympic Committee, the UN in Geneva, and many other international organizations established themselves in Switzerland, not only but also as a sign of recognition of Switzerland's good offices. Switzerland as a role model. The modest and hard-working Swiss have long been regarded as a role model worldwide. The last time a vote caused an international furore was in 2012, when 66% of Swiss voters rejected an initiative calling for 6 weeks holiday for all employees. That was bad for the economy. The people said, and accepted fewer holidays for a strong overall economy. I consider pride to be a dangerous feeling, but as a Swiss, I was proud of my country because of these qualities. Profiling neuroses of incompetent do-gooders destroyed neutrality. It is difficult to judge when Switzerland strayed from the path of virtue that has made our country so strong. Great recognition and success always harbors the danger of arrogance. People think it does no harm, and that they can afford to choose a path of lesser resistance, which is more comfortable. Micheline Calmy-Ray, a sense of mission instead of competence. Neutrality means not taking sides. It is as simple as that. However, this also means keeping your personality to yourself, otherwise neutrality does not work. That is why self-discipline is necessary. A country that is consistently neutral and does not allow itself to be put under pressure earns the respect of the big players. And the result is that no one dares to attack this country, either militarily or diplomatically. But you have to be consistent. The first clear weakening of neutrality came with Switzerland's accession to the UN. This heralded the era of profiling neurosis, and our politicians felt called upon to dictate to other countries how they should live. Our federal councillor, Micheline Calmy-Ray, spoke of active neutrality and considered the concept of neutrality to be outdated. She is very probably the forerunner of the destruction of our neutrality, a sense of mission instead of competence. File CR631, Image 1. JPG Federal Councillor, Micheline Calmy-Ray, 2003 to 2011. Mission consciousness instead of competence. No backbone without neutrality. With the destruction of neutrality came a lack of backbone towards our greatest friend, the USA. Over the past 30 years, Swiss politicians have continually caved in to our great friends, either directly or via Brussels. Holocaust money affair, banking secrecy, EU treaties, automatic adoption of EU sanctions. The Federal Council did not even realize that Switzerland was forced by the USA to save the global banking system by rescuing Credit Suisse. We reported on this. Derivatives bomb, Credit Suisse rescue, everyone was lied to, and which federal councillor was responsible for this act? Exactly, Mrs. Her counterpart, Viola Amherd, managed to sign a contract for the purchase of F-35s and to believe that they had received a fixed price. Obviously, we no longer have any persons in Bern who are able to read and even understand the contract. Washington and Brussels have realized that all you have to do is shout, and the wimps in Bern will cave in. That wouldn't have happened 40 years ago. Our politicians got us into this mess. A smarter policy during the Cold War than now, from 1991 until recently, the USA was the undisputed hegemon, the sole ruler. During the Cold War, Switzerland behaved more skillfully in its dealings with the blocs. Although the Swiss were closer to the USA, communication with the Soviet Union was surprisingly good. Now that the Iron Curtain has fallen over 30 years ago, Switzerland is dog-whistling to the Americans, who want to weaken Russia for geopolitical reasons. The Americans treat Switzerland extremely badly. Yet we still kiss the master's feet and create an atmosphere and front against Russia. Nota bene against a country that has never done anything to Switzerland. Whenever there are differences, the Americans put a knife to the neck of the Swiss. They do this because they know that we will cave in. Diplomatic custom. Weak executive. The Swiss executive consists of a 7-member collegial authority, the Federal Council. Its members are not elected by the people, but by the United Federal Assembly National Council and Council of States, which corresponds to the American House of Representatives and Senate. The problem with this is twofold. Firstly, before each election, there is a bazaar to decide which of the 26 cantons should be elected. Based on the principle of I also want a seat, and I haven't had one for a long time. And then there is the additional problem of the women's quota. Women must have more might. Whether candidates are qualified for an office is completely irrelevant. What is important is that you can fit in, so a candidate who appeals to everyone, preferably without rough edges. The result is not long in coming. In 2022, for example, Federal Councillor Elisabeth Baumer-Schneider was elected to the Federal Council from the small canton of Jura. The small canton was thus given a chance and a woman was found. She took over the Federal Department of Justice and Police FDJP. She had no idea about the job and was then transferred to the Federal Department of Home Affairs, FDHA, in 2024. A sigh of relief went through the FDJP, and the FDHA officials received expressions of sympathy. Now they have the hot potato that nobody wants. The fact that the selection of federal councillors is handled so disastrously is thanks to the members of Parliament. Apparatchiks in Parliament. The federal parliament used to be a militia parliament. That is to say, it was a part-time body, and the idea was to bring independent and competent persons into the Helvetian legislature who would work for Switzerland's interests in a part-time capacity. Today, there are fewer and fewer successful citizens in Parliament and more apparatchiks who make a nice life for themselves at the taxpayer's expense, collect attendance fees and association allowances, and in this wise achieve a lifestyle that they would never achieve in the free economy, due to their lack of competence, training, and willingness to work. These parasites haggle for positions and pursue one interest above all: the interest of making a good living from doing nothing for as long as possible and protecting other apparatchiks so that they can then also be protected. Are they all like that? No, but too many are, because the result shows that incompetent federal councillors are being bred from their ranks. Solution. The big problem is that Switzerland is still doing far too well, and most voters are not even aware of the slippery slope Switzerland is on. The solution would be simple. Stop electing losers and parasites to parliament. People who cannot show a clear track record should not have a chance to enter parliament. After all, you wouldn't sit in an aeroplane piloted by an idiot who also wants to fly, would you? Can an idiot fly? Furthermore, Parliament, and not the Federal Council, should allocate departments by looking for and electing a luminary in a particular field for a specific department. Then it would no longer depend on which canton the candidate comes from and whether they are male or female, but whether they have the competence to fulfill the job. The solution is therefore simple, but it will probably remain a pipe dream. How should the government react? Negotiation, or as Trump likes to say, making a deal, is ultimately communication. Our federal councillor has no idea how Trump works as a person, and yes, that is important. His erratic behavior, his vanity, his tendency to surround himself with beautiful women in his administration, his pleasure in deal-making are all patterns of behavior that should not be criticized but understood and classified so that the findings can then be used for Switzerland's interests. Trump has no intellect whatsoever, does not read, is a complete bellyman, and loves to be pandered to. The horizons and intuition of an interpreter born in Niederurswil then lead to the very debacle she has caused. According to a source from the White House, the Swiss press wrote that our federal councillor came across as lecturing Trump. Thank you, Mrs. Looks as competent as she is. Federal Councillor Keller Suter explains the debacle. There are thousands of Swiss people who have lived, studied, and worked in the USA for decades. Would it perhaps be a good idea to involve such people in drawing up the negotiating strategy? Or are we just pulling ideas out of our fingers and thinking that the Toggenburg flair will also work with Trump? This is a wake-up call. The Swiss people must realize what is going on and react. The first step will come at the next elections. Incompetent chatterboxes, woke fools, do-gooders, and those who put the interests of Brussels above those of Switzerland will no longer be elected and will be replaced by those who have already achieved something. Then everything will be fine.
All this that is not of the right is just as criminal and as Nazi as the Nazis did in the last World War. And Urs P. Gash also dares to say in his article in Infosperber that what Germany or its government does is also not of the right, namely this one.
Just Germany supports the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Germany perpetrated the largest genocide in history. Today, Germany is Israel's second largest arms supplier.
German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul. Germany is always obliged to support Israel. Copyright India.
Urs P. Gash international law experts disagree on whether Israel is guilty of ethnic cleansing or even in the process of committing genocide. What they do agree on is that Israel's disproportionate destructive fury is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Yet Germany, of all countries, which had sworn to never again after the Second World War, is helping the right-wing conservative and partly fundamentalist government under President Benjamin Netanyahu to proceed in the most brutal and inhumane wise in the Gaza Strip and to disenfranchise the Palestinians in the West Bank. The figures. Since the brutal terror attack by Hamas on 7 October 2023, the USA and Germany have supplied by far the most weapons to Israel. Germany sold around 30% of the heavy weapons imported by Israel, the rest came mainly from the USA. These included components for ships such as the Sa'ar 6 corvettes, a submarine, air defense systems and components for armored vehicles, as well as ammunition and electronics. After the start of the war in 2023, German arms exports to Israel temporarily increased tenfold compared to the previous year, reaching around €353 million in 2023. This makes the German arms industry one of the biggest profiteers of Israel's campaign of revenge against the Palestinians. At the end of May 2025, Federal Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul said, "As a country that understands Israel's security and existence as a fundamental principle, Germany is always obliged to support Israel." Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Canada are different. These countries have not increased their much more modest arms deliveries to Israel since the start of the war, but have instead reduced them. The International Court of Justice (ICJ) already ruled in January 2024 that the humanitarian situation in Gaza was catastrophic. It called on Israel to take protective measures for the Palestinian civilian population and to take measures to overcome the hunger crisis and prevent epidemics. The ICJ pointed out that the Israeli army's conduct of the war partially violated the Genocide Convention. In contrast to the USA and Israel, Germany is a member of the ICJ. Violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Indiscriminate attacks, numerous air and artillery attacks targeted entire neighborhoods or refugee camps, whereby civilian casualties were accepted or even intended. Destruction of civilian infrastructure, the systematic shelling of homes, schools, hospitals, water treatment plants and electricity plants is strictly prohibited by the laws of war, unless these facilities are used directly as military bases of operations. Collective punishment and siege, the almost complete blockade of Gaza, the targeted starvation of the civilian population by restricting food, water and electricity, and the targeted prevention of humanitarian aid are illegal under Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and also under the Hague Convention and are considered war crimes. Forced displacement. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were repeatedly forced to flee and were repeatedly displaced from supposed protection zones. The UN speaks of forcible transfer, an offense that can be qualified as a crime against humanity. Targeted killing of civilians and humanitarian aid workers. There are documented attacks on UN convoys, journalists, rescue workers, and employees of international aid organizations who enjoy special protection under international law. Use of prohibited weapons. In some cases, the use of white phosphorus and other prohibited weapons has been documented. Obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. The deliberate destruction of evidence can be an additional violation of obligations under international law.
When I think of the fact that no one listened to all that Svath and I said with the warnings in the 1940s, it was no different then than it is now, with the authorities now interfering and slyly revisiting the old in a new wise and playing to their might. It's true that Svath's and my efforts were punished back in the 1940s, as has been done recently to disgust us here in Hinterschmidruti, away and away. Because at that time, because I had put this in writing, the result was that because Esther stole everything from the debt bank and handed it over to the teacher Frey, with whom I then still had to go to 4th grade. I had to go to 4th grade. Class was beaten to death by Frey together with Horiton, sometimes together with those from the sect who constantly harassed me with other sectarians. All of them together somehow managed to persecute me everywhere throughout my life, and also to persecute me in many other countries. With the last attacks, but that's all there is to say about it, and it's not something that should be publicized, which was also suggested to various witnesses who witnessed some of it. There is nothing more to say about it, just as it would also be pointless to continue talking about the plastic, because even today people would not listen to what is being said, just as they would not stop trying to drive up the sheer mass of overpopulation. This, as well as also not that AI or artificial intelligence is being pushed even more futuristically, through which it will inevitably come that the peoples will ultimately lose their last freedom, and in this respect will be much worse off than the human beings were at the time of the Reeves. The fact that the card system will take away their cash, and they will only be able to pay digitally, and that their private money will also be controlled down to the last centum and penny by the tax authorities. Banks and authorities, to a large extent already today, is something that the populations who have become extremely indifferent have not thought about and have neither stopped nor prevented. This, just as AI is also not being prevented in the respect that it will be further developed in such a way that humanity, like robots of all kinds, do not become self-thinking, self-deciding and self-acting androids that are directed against humanity. The fact that mass murderers, such as Netanyahu in Israel, are not deposed by the cowardly peoples, but are tolerated and additionally supported by many supporters and other governments, also knocks the bottom out of all barrels, and so the Hitler-like can continue to murder in his genocide. This, as Hamas is doing, with the dictator of America, Trump, promoting the genocide of this mass murderer with his army of murderers. I have the following, which Achim sent me.
This is not a quote from a film, but a sentence that an Israeli soldier told the psychologist Yoel Eliezer about the operation in Gaza. Here are quotes from the article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that speak for themselves and leave you speechless.
It is like a drug. You feel like you are the law. You make the rules. As if you are God from the moment you leave the place called Israel and enter the Gaza Strip. I have no problem with women. One threw a slipper at me, so I kicked her here, points to crotch, smashed everything here. Today she can't have any more children.
An Arab was just walking down the street, about 25 years old, didn't throw a stone, nothing. Bang, a bullet in the stomach. Shot him in the stomach and he died on the pavement and we drove away indifferent.
I felt like a Nazi. It looked exactly like we were actually the Nazis and they were the Jews.
A new commandant came to us. We went with him on the first patrol at 6 hours in the morning. He stopped. Not a soul on the street, just a little 4-year-old boy playing in the sand in his yard. The commander suddenly runs off, grabs the boy and breaks his arm at the elbow and his leg here. Kicks him 3 times in the stomach and leaves. We all stood there with our mouths open. Looked at him in shock. I asked the commander, "What is your story?" He told me, "These children must be killed from the day they are born." When a commander does that, it becomes legitimate.
There is complete dehumanization here. They're not really treated like they're human beings. Looking back, the hardest thing for me is what I felt, or actually what I didn't feel when I was there. It bothers me that it didn't bother me. The process becomes normalized and eventually it just stops bothering you.
Regarding artificial intelligence, my grandfather has made you see a lot of things in the future. Also, you predicted what is happening now in your poem that you don't want to write down. And what you mention, that a war with flying devices will come, that is already so far. Namely that the flying devices are drones whose development is already progressing to kamikaze drones. whereby the Arleon and his crew have now fathomed this, but you should keep quiet about that. The human being's intelligence will be overtaken by artificial intelligence and become independent. As you know, because you have seen everything in the future with my grandfather, you know what is coming. And the consequences will be worse than around 75,000 years ago, when only a few thousand, so there are already various flying devices. And two such were, whereby Earth humans, through their sheer numbers, not only destroy the planet and most of nature and largely wipe out the fauna and flora, but also largely destroy themselves, in addition to the androids turning against them and...
We shouldn't really be talking about that, because the Earthlings are running to exterminate themselves, and saying anything against it is of no use and will achieve nothing. It's more appropriate to say something about the American dictator Trump and the majority of the American people. Because I wonder how lowly intelligent and simple-minded the majority of these people must be to tolerate such a lout as a dictator, and to be supported by a simple-minded majority of the population. However, the latter not only supports the mass murder of the mad mass murderer Netanyahu, but also the war in Ukraine via the clown, sneak, and arms beggar Zelensky, which of course also promotes America's hegemonic delusion.
A war that would not have lasted even 3 months if America had not been behind it all, especially the warmongering then President Biden, as then also all the lowly intelligent and irresponsible leaders of all those states who, according to America's agitation, have supplied weapons to Ukraine and are still irresponsibly doing so. This is what has led to a strange world war, an aid world war, so to speak, which would have been avoided and ended in a very short time without these arms deliveries. However, the fact that it has continued for years to this day is solely the fault of those in power, and that part of the population who vehemently support the arms deliveries and the unfounded hatred of Russia. Because America is the real aggressor in the war, even if Russia started it and is therefore guilty. However, the criminal behavior of those powerful states and parts of the population who supplied and are still supplying weapons to Ukraine and to the war fanatic Zelensky is as guilty of this as is also the case with Israel's warfare against Hamas, which is equally murderous and unscrupulous on both sides. Above all, however, there is America, so that the hateful war criminal Netanyahu can continue the genocide unceasingly as long as the dictator of America and his like-minded people stand by him. And all the lowly, intelligent, simple-minded people supply weapons, whereby this is referring to Germany, which is governed by Nazi-minded people whose senses do not crave peace, but war and destruction.
That is correct. And Netanyahu is actually waging war against the Palestinians, not simply against the murderous organization Hamas, because basically he wants to exterminate the Palestinians through his genocide, whereby Hamas is just clearing the way for him to do so, and whereby he is not at all concerned with freeing the Hamas hostages. But America is also behind this, because the America dictator despot Trump, with his delusions of hegemony, is lying in wait for the mass killer Netanyahu to do the dirty work with his killer army and pull the hot chestnuts out of the fire.
As you already mentioned in your GE.
Please don't bring that up again. But it is the case that America is behind everything that causes trouble on Earth, because America wants to win war and ultimately world domination. And the larger humanity becomes in terms of numbers. The more and the faster it succeeds, because the more human beings populate the Earth, the more wars will come about and be waged in which America can interfere and thereby fulfill its hegemonic delusion. This delusion was also murderously demonstrated by the 2 atomic bombs dropped in Japan 80 years ago, when America reduced Hiroshima and Nagasaki to rubble and thus murdered more than 300,000 human beings. The lowly intelligent and simple-minded of the world were still cheering for this, and in their low intelligence were not able to think as far as to realize that this would ultimately lead to a nuclear war in the future, because various states would also produce nuclear bombs. And one fine day, someone might actually be crazy enough, for whatever idiotic reasons, to completely destroy humanity or the entire planet with a nuclear strike. with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 80 years ago. The greatest crime against humanity ever committed on Earth in the new era was committed, surpassing even everything that Hitler and his entire NSDAP criminally caused with the World War. Because the monstrous crime is not limited to the deed, but affects all the future. This is because since 1945, several countries have come into possession of nuclear bombs, etc., which represent a constant threat of terror into the distant future. And it must always be expected that an insane and completely irresponsible state power will provoke a nuclear war. In this respect, North Korea in particular is at the forefront, as are also the other nuclear-armed states. This is because all those government criminals around the world who are not at the head of the nations as righteous people, but who enslave them and exploit them with taxes, effectively control every last cent of the citizens' money, and completely and utterly steal every freedom from them. To this end, they start and break out wars that have to be paid for with taxpayers' money, and also cause countless deaths and senseless destruction. There is also the question of how long it will be before something monstrous happens, which makes me think of what could happen if all hell breaks loose due to EMP, which can be triggered by nuclear explosions or E-bombs, for example, especially if they are triggered in the free atmosphere. But there is also the sun, because when it erupts violently, the enormous energy and force rushes out into Sol space and hits the planets. The closest ones in particular are affected enormously by this. So that's Mercury, Venus, and the extremely heavily populated Earth, as well as Mars further out.
What is this EMP?
I'm sure you know it, but you guys probably call it something else. EMP stands for the English term electromagnetic pulse. If I remember correctly, this is also called an e-mobility provider, but such e-pulses can be triggered by human beings, for example, or by nuclear explosions when they die in the atmosphere. These are
Yes, I understand. Of course I know what it is now. I wasn't familiar with the term you mentioned. But you wanted to explain something.
Yes, electromagnetic pulses are a tremendously strong electromagnetic energy that is released, effectively a very high wave intensity. This can not only cause damage to a planet and its nature and fauna and flora, but also to human achievements, such as power grids and electronic devices, such as computers and telephone systems, etc. And as I said before, EMP can be caused artificially by solar flares, for example, which is a completely natural phenomenon, or by human beings through nuclear explosions, such as nuclear weapons or other special weapons. But what I was talking about earlier, it is pointless for me to try to explain in more detail that America is now under a very evil and nasty dictatorship, which is now trying more vehemently than ever to implement the old-fashioned hegemony delusion and maltreat the whole world with idiotically high import tariffs. The fact that all the warnings are pointless, because all state powers are fearfully and cowardly helplessly scurrying around the powerful and world-dominating America, which in my opinion is only done by most earthlings out of fear and cowardice, is like me carrying water into the Rhine and emptying it there, completely pointlessly.
It actually wouldn't make sense either.
So that's what I'm thinking. So let's talk about something else.
Good, then I have a question that I can't answer myself, but that you might be able to answer for me. It is incomprehensible to me why many Earth humans simply bow to others without resistance and allow themselves to be dominated.
This is something I think about from time to time. But to your question, I think that it is not so easy to explain, and moreover, it is not something that human beings on Earth understand or want to understand. This is because there is often an element of faith involved, but this is something that people also generally don't want to realize. People always say, no, I won't be influenced, and I don't believe this or that. But the rule here is also that the exact opposite is the case, namely that it always boils down to believing something and not thinking for yourself.
You've told me that many times, but it still doesn't explain what I want to know.
I also can't help you there. Sorry.
But you said you often worry about that also?
I did. I even wrote it down and gave it to Ava to read. Only a few lines, but...
Then let me also see and read it.
It was just a draft that I threw away again. Something about gaslighting I wrote, but in my opinion it is not.
I understand, but I'm interested. Besides, what does gaslighting mean?
I don't know that word. It is a term that comes from psychology and actually refers to the kind of psychological manipulation whereby the human being is deliberately made disorientated in such a way that he becomes completely insecure and loses his sense of reality, which damages his self-confidence and allows him to be manipulated because his clear thinking is gradually adversely affected because he increasingly begins to believe what he is constantly being indoctrinated with and allows himself to be beaten down as a result.
I'm interested in that.
If you mean, then just the following. For my part, I reject any form of evil gaslighting because this is a deliberate distortion of a person's own perceptions, to whose unsettling of their own mind and memory, every truth is twisted, and everything is constantly set right towards them, with lies and deceit. In this way, because the person only believes and does not think, decide and act independently and truthfully, an extremely wildly distorted perception of reality, and a belief is sought and also effectively induced, whereby ultimately absolute and complete might is gained over the person concerned, and everything he or she is taught is taken at face value and believed. The person in question is then irrevocably under the thumb of the manipulative, indoctrinating, shabby and unscrupulous human being in question, who exercises his might in every degenerate and evil wise of his character and dominates the fellow human beings who have been made submissive to him. As gaslighting relates to one person or to several persons, so the principle arises likewise. In likewise wise with regard to any influence centered on a religious or secular belief in any form, consequently it is actually the same as comes about in the seizure of power over a person. A belief is always based on gaslighting or indoctrination, regardless of whether it comes about in the wise of an organized religion or sect, or in a secular sense, or also in whatever way, such as an opinion, a bondage, a compulsion, or as a result of a spiritualistic belief. It is and remains a belief. In most cases, gaslighting takes place through upbringing, as parents, siblings and relatives, etc. already harass and indoctrinate the growing toddlers, and thus imperceptibly practice a nasty and lousy form of gaslighting. And over time the child falls into an instilled belief from which it is also hardly able to free itself in adulthood. It should be said that a belief always remains a belief if it is not discarded as a result of reason, be it a belief in miracles, a belief in salvation, a belief in history, a belief in ethics, a belief in science, a belief in narrative, a belief in rituals, a belief in systems, a belief in demons, a belief in culture, etc., etc. 1. Is mainly faith in religious form, that is to say fiduciary faith, which refers to the fact that human beings are persuaded to place their personal trust in an imaginary God, who is believed in and worshipped as a savior, and not just as a revealer, thereby completely and utterly abandoning any personal independence of their own weal and woe, and hopefully placing this in the will of God. 2 is the intellectualistic faith, which stands as agreement to, allegedly, revealed truths, whereby the revealed cannot be proven as effective truth in every case, and often only corresponds to a momentary or present truth. This is because everything is evolutionary, and therefore always continues, and sooner or later brings absolutely new insights or new truths. 3 is the performative or linguistic belief, which is carried out or concretized by the speech act or speech and the non-subsequent action. That is to say that what was said is not done, which means that as a result of the speech only a belief arises, which proves to be a belief and a lie due to the concrete decision moment of not immediately putting everything into practice. It is therefore insincere and intended to impress and prove to someone through a belief in lies that something is supposed to be true that is actually a lie and a fraud. As is the case today with government reports that are mendaciously published on social media because the people should not learn the truth about the many crooked, harmful, and idiotic things that are being done. The attentive human being, however, will notice from the way people speak when something is contrived and performative. They will notice the lie and have the feeling that what is being said is not meant seriously and corresponds to a lie. Unfortunately, However, only an absolutely small minority of the minority of humanity is educated in such a way that it really perceives the effective truth, is not somehow addicted to a belief, but really only absolutely self-thinking, and absolutely attaches all value to unbelief. The truth is that around 92% of the Earth's population are believers according to Plyer and research, with the vast majority of them belonging to the 12 classical religions, namely Christianity in first place, with Roman Catholicism coming before Protestantism. The second largest religion is Islam, while Hinduism comes in third place. Baha'i, Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism, Judaism, Shintoism, Sikhism, Taoism, and Zoroastrianism are the other major religions, although there are countless sects and variations of all of them. These have a wide variety of beliefs, including spiritualism and devil worshippers, etc., with some very strange forms. When I think that the lowly intelligent believers in Christianity, lowly intelligent precisely because they don't think for themselves, have been lied to and deceived since time immemorial, then I feel really sorry for them. When I think of the fact that the Pope Julius III to be precise, said in the presence of Svath Colon,
that among all the advice to be given at present, the most important is that every endeavor must be made to see that no human being also learns the least of the truth, which is effectively written here in the so-called gospel, for otherwise there will be no faith in Christ in the future.
As far as I know, this pope resided from about 1550 for 5 years, and then died, as I remember Svath saying, who had heard these words from Pope Julius III himself. I also don't know to what extent and whether this secret conversation between the Pope's assessors at the time was recorded in writing. Furthermore, I know very well that apart from what I have received from the writing about the level Arahat Athersata, and from Isa Rashid from the handwritten original of the Emmanuel disciple Judas Iscarioth, as I have written in the book Talmud Emmanuel, that no other written material about the work of Emmanuel exists. So there are no written records at the time of Emmanuel and his work and teachings, and moreover, his name was not Jesus, as is mendaciously claimed, but really Emmanuel. He was also not an alleged Son of God, but a woman named Mary was impregnated and...
You should tell us what really happened. So far, you've always kept that a secret, but I'm asking why, because it would only be fair if you said what you know about what the truth is.
You're asking a bit much, my friend. And besides, I don't know if it would be good for me to say anything about it. I really don't know if it would be correct.
That's where I think a little differently, and in such a way that it would just be fair for all those Earth humans who strive for the truth and are not believers in the Jesus and Christ lies.
I understand what you say and mean, but effectively I don't know bim-eyed whether it would be correct if I...
You are well aware that you don't know until you do it and have done it. And just as I know it, so may all those also know and experience the truth who...
That's good. Then I'll tell you what happened then. You're right, it is correct that those human beings who are not simply believers should know what really happened. Then I'll let the cat out of the bag and say once, well, what, that Maria? Should I really say it?
It is correct if you do.
Good, then so be it. Mary was impregnated by a Plejaren who was called Gabriel here on earth, but whose Plejarenic name was really Gargel, meaning he who comes from creation or he who comes from nature. Gargel and Mary were married and lived together and already had children. But when Gargel died unexpectedly, when she was pregnant with Emmanuel, the Jewish Joseph came together with Mary, who was in old friendship with her and Gargel. He then also became the father of Emmanuel. Although he was the stepfather, he accepted Emmanuel as his son, and also treated him as such. Now, what is actually still important to explain can be briefly stated in such a way that there are no longer any sources that would bear witness to Emmanuel's birth and work, because the original writings of Judas Iscarioth were completely burnt when Isa Rashid was in Lebanon, in a refugee camp, where a fire broke out and he lost everything. Years later, he died in Baghdad, Iraq, where we went together and where I also met Aisha Kurtulmush, my girlfriend, and her brother. It was only around 117 years after the crucifixion of Emmanuel, who was actually tied and nailed to a Y-shaped olive tree trunk, from which he was then freed and cared for by his followers at night, and later fled to Srinagar, that something was effectively written about a Jesus or Christ who had been crucified under the direction of Pontius Pilate, etc., as a result of hearsay and hearsay again and again. So the name Emmanuel was no longer mentioned, but the fictitious name Jesus or Christ was used, as it has been falsely and mendaciously spread more and more since then, and is still used today.
There's probably also no point in talking about it, because the believers of the Christian religion don't want to hear or know the truth.
I guess you're right, because they're afraid to accept the truth, afraid that the imaginary God would punish them for it if they stopped believing all the nonsense and primitive religious lies. But I have something more important, because since Michael does interviews with me and then uses them in his programs, we have now discovered in a conversation that there is quite a huge misunderstanding about the Nokodemion lineage, and has been since time immemorial, because the heralds of the teaching, who have been called prophets since time immemorial and are still called that today. This is despite the fact that they are not actually to be called prophets, but simply heralds with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life of the Nokodemion from the Ankar universe, which has been around since time immemorial. In the ancient times of the heralds, thousands of Earth years ago, it was already said that the heralds' prophets would continue the lineage of Nokodemion's teaching, whereby the names of the respective heralds or prophets were also mentioned, namely Enoch, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Elijah, Emmanuel, and Muhammad, and that these would come from the lineage of Nokodemion. However, the line of prophets does not mean descendants up to the very distant descendants of Nokodemion, but only prophets or heralds who constantly carry on Nokodemion's teaching. That is why it has been taught since time immemorial that the teaching is carried on or taught by Nokodemion's line of prophets. That is to say that the line of prophets or the line is to be understood as successors who spread the teaching. However, this was unfortunately misunderstood at the time, as is also the case today, because the lineage does not refer to the descendants and the continuation of their most distant descendants up to the present day, but to the lineage of the teaching, or to the fact that this was never interrupted and was continuously and constantly carried on and taught again and again by new heralds prophets, and is also taught now, which should also continue to be the case. Thus Enoch, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Elijah, Emmanuel, Muhammad, and currently I, Billy, came as a lineage bearer and as a new personality of the teaching of Nokodemion in order to continue to teach it. So the creation energy form as well as the creation life energy form of the herald Nokodemion has never been reborn. But it was always and always a new personality who was taken over as a herald by another herald, and through whom the teaching was spread again. The creation energy form and creation life energy form of Nokodemion transferred back to the creation energy level after his human teaching work and death, from which it was sent out to revitalize a human being or a new personality. From this level, no rebirth ever took place again, just as no rebirth of a creation energy form and a creation life energy form connected with it ever appears as a rebirth. So it must be clearly stated, for which, after the conversation with Michael, the time has come for certain human beings to realize that what could not be explained for thousands of years because Earthlings lacked the understanding for it, which is certainly still the case in many cases today, can and may now be clarified, which is the effective truth. Namely, that the lineage to Nokodemion that exists to this day is not a lineage of the reincarnations of the herald Nokodemion, nor a lineage of his descendants and most distant descendants to the present day, but effectively only that it is the lineage of Nokodemion's teaching that has been preserved to this day. Furthermore, it must be made clear, which must be said again and again, that Nokodemion's teaching was first brought and taught millions of years ago, not on Earth and not in our Dern universe, but in the so-called Ankar parallel universe. This happened because the earliest Plejarin were capable of space travel and traveled through a natural passage to our Dern universe and to Earth, where Nokodemion's teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life was taught and spread. This teaching I have been teaching for some time, and for this reason I founded the Figu, This is founded as an association, and about which Jose Barreto Silva from Brazil has written a summary, which I am happy to reproduce here, with a foreword by me, which I am using for an educational pamphlet he has drafted, which I am now working on, which will of course take some time.
What creation is the all-encompassing existence of all things, and thus of everything that is all universal existing and existing things, and therefore the entirety of the real existing nature, which absolutely everything and everything in the universe, invisible, invisible, tangible, as well as intangible, tangible, and impalpable, and is alive. Creation is not an imaginary God, has nothing to do with gods or idols and saints, for all of these are fantasies invented by Earth humans. Invented by earthly man through his fantasies, fantasy creatures, fairy tale creatures, creatures of fantasy and illusion. In other words, something that is only illusory and absolutely imaginary or existing only in an imagination and is not real and imagined. Billy, August 2025.
As for what Jose has written, which I am working up into a brochure, by and large it also includes the book OM, or the actual concept of OM. This prompts me to explain what the OM symbol means in relation to the teachings taught by the Figu.
Meaning of the Om symbol in Nokodemion's teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life.
What the OM symbol says in and of itself, and what it actually stands for in terms of meaning and what values are hidden in it, as these are also expressed in the religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, although their understanding is to be understood in religious terms, which of course does not apply to the understanding of the Figu, and thus not to the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life of Nokodemion. The representational values of the OM symbol, of course absolutely without the religious view of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, naturally remain. Thus the OM says what is actually true and will also be true in the future. So that the OM symbol unquestionably stands for the values powerful original sound of creation, or sound of the nature of the past, present, and future. The OM symbol also has the meaning and significance of connecting with the unity of creation or with nature, and meditatively immersing oneself in it in order to effectively harmonize with it and to appreciate, honor, and respect it. This means that human beings should be attentive to creation or the whole of nature and respect. Care for and protect it because it is life in its entirety and is able to guarantee it as long as it is kept in order and given the necessary care and protection. Nature as true creation, which is neither an imaginary God invented by human beings, nor gods, idols, or saints, which is everything that exists in the entire universe, is not to be worshipped and idolized, but to be appreciated, treated with honor, respected, cared for, and protected. If only because it is truly the foundation stone of all living things, ranging from the tiniest of all existence to the most powerful in the almost endless universe. And it should be further explained. The OM symbol found its origin in ancient times, when earlier human beings dealt with philosophical concepts and created symbols for them that tell us what was, what is, what remains, and what will be. This is also how the OM symbol was created, which actually stands for everything. For the beginning or the emergence and the endlessness of the absolute being from the nihilo, the endless nothingness of endless duration. This for the timelessness of the past. But what exists now in the present or the center also exists in all the future to come. The OM symbol stands for the real effective truth of the existence of creation, which has been nature since the beginning, and represents it as the creation of all that exists, just as its original powerful sound also resounds eternally through the universe. The OM symbol encompasses all sounds, humanity, all of nature, and everything that exists. Creation is Mother Nature herself, nature, which is truly the honeycomb of its own creation. The symbol symbolizes the creational pulsation and hum of all that exists, the cosmos, the universe, and planet Earth. The OM symbol symbolizes the active life energy of creation, or the currently active life energy of creation itself. The symbol stands for the essence of ultimate reality, for the true innermost consciousness and unconsciousness of human beings, in addition to their physical consciousness and subconsciousness, their bodies and organs. Creation itself, nature, is the original powerful sound of all that exists. Its sound is the existence of the all-encompassing universe. And the sound of creation, of nature, from which everything exists, according to its order in the entire universe, remains as long as the existence of creation lasts and is constant.
To me, it is always amazing how you are able to formulate your explanations.
I owe that to your grandfather Svath, because he taught me to always formulate everything correctly so that people listening to me really understand what I'm saying. That also saves a lot of questions when something is explained in detail. But if you're interested, I'd like to mention some of the things Jose wrote and which I'm turning into a brochure.
Yes, let's hear what his thoughts are.
Then I want to start with what I think is most important regarding what he has to report and explain about Figu. He begins with this colon.
In the name of creation, which is love, knowledge, wisdom, truth, and perfection. Jmmanuel Silva, Brazil, author and translator, August 2025. It is better by the teaching of the Herald Billy, Edward Albert Meier Hard. Only bitterly true truth than to be eternally slapped in the face by the sweetness and poisonous lies of religions and sects of all colors and denominations, Jmmanuel Silva. Veritas evidence non est probanda. The silent revelation of truth. All truth goes through exactly 3 stages. First, the truth is ridiculed and is denied or distorted and blamed with much hatred. That is a pure lie, deception, and fraud. Then it is fought to the death and finally taken for granted, as self-evident, understood as self-evident truth, and as true self-evident reality, and accepted in the entire earthly world. Veritas evidence non est probanda. The truth is obvious and cannot be proven. Falsehood, lies, deception, and fraud never come close to the real truth, but they disturb, persecute, harass, and destroy it, and that from front and back and everywhere. And so it is also with the truth of creation, the real truth, and there are not enough shovels to bury the truth, and those who try end up digging their own graves by committing suicide as a result of their own lies. Never hate, because hate can only be defeated with non-hate. This is a real truth of creation. I, Jmmanuel Silva, have knowledge of the most diverse totems regarding many of the most diverse religions and secret societies, cults of all colors, flags and philosophies and other various beliefs, etc., faiths, etc., as you can only imagine. And yes, I admit that I also used to worship Jesus, and was looking for and knocked on the wrong doors in search of answers to my questions about the true meaning of life, because I knocked on the wrong doors because I asked myself, who am I? Why do I exist? And for what purpose? Yes, I knocked on the wrong doors and found no answers. I never looked up to the sky, and never saw a flying Pleiar and ray ships up there, coming from the infinite depths of the universe. I used to be a correct caveman. On freezing cold Sundays, I had huge atlases that I couldn't use. And in the news from the real truth that constantly reaches us, nobody can notice anything, because everyone is always too busy to think correctly. First of all, I, José Silva, have to say that I am a student of the creation energy teaching taught by Billy Maher, as I'm a student of the true creation energy teaching, as it has been handed down unadulterated for billions of years, and comes from the true herald of the teaching line of Nokodemion from the Ankar universe. I would like to emphasize clearly and very emphatically that the FIGO, Free Interest Group Universal, as well as all its worldwide members, does not discriminate against or hate any persons, etc., just as the FIGO also does not support or promote any small groups, private or organized institutions or large groups, committees and initiatives, whether political or religious, philosophical, secular, or of any unrighteous nature, because the FIGO is and remains neutral on all sides. This is because the FIGO is and will remain neutral in all respects, as it also does not support elements that engage in reprehensible or inhumane criminal acts, racism and misogyny, racial supremacy, Nazism, neo-Nazism, right-wing extremism, fascism or anarchism, etc., nor persons, groups or organizations with a xenophobic, anti-Semitic or racially discriminatory attitude. Terrorism, as well as criminal attacks, acts or other unlawful behavior against life, the personal safety of human beings and state security or order will not be tolerated. All criminal offences frowned upon by the FIGO also include any kind of theft, any kind of treason and drug trafficking, as well as drug use and coercion, etc. But FIGO also distances itself from any kind of crime, such as murder, manslaughter or killing on demand, suicide, domestic violence, blackmail, bullying, robbery, revenge and retaliation, failure to provide assistance, any ways of intentional bodily harm, psycho-emotional violence, terror of any kind, destruction of self-confidence, any kind of abuse, etc., etc. Homophobia is just as frowned upon by the FIGO as injustice of any kind, including war and strife of any kind and vice, as well as unjust attitudes and anti-democratic worldviews. Terrorist acts against human beings, states, groups, organizations or institutes, etc., are also frowned upon by the FIGO, as are all forms of zoophilia, cruelty to animals, pedophilia, rape and slavery, rejection and accusations of guilt, character assassination, insults, humiliation and any kind of defamation, deprivation of liberty and manipulation, etc., etc., are also frowned upon by FIGO, as is the solicitation of members for unlawful or even questionable undertakings, as is also the case with religions, sex and participation in war, etc. The FIGO is free of any religious belief, and therefore non-denominational, just as it is also free of any worldly belief, and neutral in every respect. All human beings of any faith are respected and as such are accorded all due dignity and honor. This applies whether they profess Islamic, Christian, Jewish or any other religious or secular faith. In principle, however, no support will be given to unrighteous persons such as criminals, groups or institutions, etc., who are addicted to terror or any kind of violence, etc., with regard to their faith, worldview, social view, and general order. This, as also those acts are not and never will be recognized as rightful, which are unlawful, politically or religiously are certain or terrorist, as also physical, verbal, or written personal attacks of any wise, directed against certain human beings or groups, are not acceptable. Personal attacks, quarreling, bickering, or clinching. Bickering, and discord in general in verbal form or in writing are absolutely frowned upon and unacceptable in any way. Right-wing extremism is dealt with by many authorities and other state and private institutions, committees and initiatives. They all have different tasks and deal with certain facets of the phenomenon. However, the Association FIGO, Freie Interessengemeinschaft Universell, does not support them, nor Nazis, neo-Nazis, or any kind of terrorist group, nor small or large criminals, such groups or organizations that exist on planet Earth. Right-wing extremism in the form of evil neo-Nazism is currently the greatest threat in all states on Earth, which particularly jeopardizes every free, peaceful and democratic basic order, as well as a truly social and righteous coexistence. Coexistence, however, is based on the fact that all humanity on the entire planet Earth should live safely and well, in peace, freedom and harmony, and absolutely independent of any compulsion for or against religion, skin color, origin and gender. It is therefore all the more important to recognize right-wing extremist behavior at the outset and to combat it verbally and in writing with all the means of our defensive democracy, which presupposes that the actors behind bad, evil, seditious, warmongering and anti-order and other behavior contrary to law and order are identified at an early stage and kept in view and under control, so that they cannot cause any harm or mischief. The symbols and signs of the scene can provide serious indications of this. They symbolize the right-wing extremists' inhumane, anti-democratic worldview, which aims to strengthen the scene's cohesion and distinguish it from the outside world. Their intensive use demonstrates how dangerous right-wing extremists still are. In public, this is reflected in a large number of propaganda offences, even if in some cases ignorance and provocation may be the reasons. José Mahid Silva, Brazil.
This is really very remarkable. I think it's a good idea what you're making of it, or rather what you're putting together as a brochure, and I'll be happy to take a look at it. But now, my friend, now Edward, I have to tell you that Ta is coming to visit you in a few days and will inform you about certain things. I also want to discuss some things with you now, which I won't dictate to you then, following which I will now.